Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you all could be here. My name is Wendy Roth, and I'm a professor of sociology here at Penn. On behalf of myself and Ariela Schachter from Washington University in St. Louis, I'd like to welcome you to the Symposium on Genetic Ancestry and Perceptions of Race, Impacts in Social and Medical Contexts. Advances in genomic technology and lowered sequencing costs have not only rapidly increased the number of people being sequenced in biomedical and clinical settings, but also in commercial and non-medical settings. More than 1 in 5 American adults, which is more than 50 million people in the US alone, have taken direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry tests since 2003. The information that genomic sequencing or commercial testing provides about genetic ancestry is not the same as race or ethnicity. Yet many people see genetic ancestry information as informing, if not outright determining, their understanding of race. And this is often aggravated by the use of labels for describing genetic ancestry that overlap with common racial or ethnic groups. In March 2023, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a consensus report on using population descriptors in genetics and genomics research. The report recommended against the use of race, ethnicity, or geographic origin as proxies for genetic ancestry groups in genetic and genomic science. But it may take some time for researchers and the broader communities to make this shift, if they make it at all. And it's not always clear how historical and social constructs like race and ethnicity influence an understanding of genetic ancestry or vice versa. And this issue is part of what motivated this event. So I like to start conversations like this by defining some terms. I realize that there may be many people here who are experts in this, but just as a starting point for some conversation today, I want to start by defining race. So as a sociologist, a common definition I use is that race is a social and cognitive structure that divides people into categories on the basis of characteristics that are believed to be inherent. In the US, those are usually understood as physical or biological characteristics. Sound? Sound still working?
Sound is still working.
Sound is not working? You can try turning off and then on again the speaker in the back. That's what worked last time. Thank you. And hopefully people on Zoom can still hear. All right, I'm going to continue. So I think of race as a social and cognitive structure that divides people into categories on the basis of characteristics that are believed to be inherent. In the US, those are usually understood as physical or biological characteristics, but determining which characteristics constitute the race is a choice that people and societies make. And which characteristics they choose varies across societies, across time periods, and can stem from different historical motivations. I typically define ethnicity as a separate social and cognitive structure that divides people into groups based on a shared history, common ancestry, and a cultural focus involving symbolic elements that define their sense of themselves as a people. Genetic ancestry refers to information about the people an individual is biologically descended from. It includes their genetic relationships and can refer to distant ancestry spanning hundreds or thousands of years. It can be combined with historical information to infer where the person's distant ancestors lived. I hope people in the room at least can hear me if I talk at this one. Okay. Hopefully we'll get everything else sorted out too. So as we considered how these concepts might be understood and used, we were particularly interested in how genetic ancestry might matter for how observers perceive another person's race. This becomes relevant as more people share their genetic ancestry test results publicly, And it could also be relevant in contexts where others may have access to a person's genetic ancestry information in a way that could potentially influence their treatment or outcomes. And medical or clinical settings seem to be a context where we could imagine this happening. Our goal for this multidisciplinary symposium then is to bring medical researchers, clinicians, health scholars, and social scientists into conversation about the way that genetic ancestry information may influence observers' perceptions of others' race. And also the implications that that could have in both social and medical contexts. Within the social sciences, some scholarship focuses on how racial perception or the appraisal of others can vary by the context, often with significant consequences for treatment and socioeconomic outcomes. And recently, this has included consideration of genetic ancestry information. In medicine and related fields, scholarship often focuses on racial inequalities in healthcare provision and quality of care, race-based medicine, and how diagnoses may factor in information about a patient's race. By bringing scholars engaged in these bodies of scholarship together, we're hoping to generate some discussion about how race may be assessed in clinical as well as other contexts, including by medical practitioners, clinicians, and we hope that this can inform future research agendas on how genetic ancestry, appearance, self-identification, administrative health records, and other sources of information might differentially shape patients' experiences and health outcomes. Okay, I want to take a moment to thank those who made this symposium possible. First of all, thank you to all of the presenters and moderators who are here with us today, and also to the National Human Genome Research Institute for funding this symposium as part of an R21 grant in the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics. I'd particularly like to thank Renee Sterling and David Roth for their help. And there are several people who contributed to the planning and the logistics of this event. First and foremost, I would like to sincerely and strongly thank Alex Torrez, who is in the back there, who has done a tremendous amount of work to bring this event together. I'm also very grateful to Emily Curran right here for all of her work and willingness to help out whenever needed. We also received outstanding support from staff in sociology and the Population Studies Center at Penn. So I want to give a huge thanks to Aisha Graham, who has been coming in and out, helping us just now, Julia Hawthorne, Kaylee Caldwell, Dawn Ryan, Laura Van Druff, and Nikia Perez-Kibler. Thanks also to Penn Sociology and the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy for co-sponsoring the event. And also for their dedication to helping us publicize the event, I'd like to thank Amina Alamin at Penn Center for Global Genomics and Health Equity, and Hafisa Akram at the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. Now, before we begin, I just want to share some practical logistics with you. Our symposium website address is on the screen behind me. It was also in the email our virtual participants received with their Zoom link. And there you'll find a detailed schedule of the day with descriptions of the talks. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll also find our presenters' biographies. For those of you who are here in person, there are restrooms on this floor. When you exit this room, a female restroom is around to the right and a male restroom is around to the left. There are also additional restrooms in the same locations on floors 2 and 3, but there is a much larger all-gender restroom on the ground floor behind the bank of elevators. Lunch and our afternoon coffee break will be held in the second floor atrium. Now, during the discussion and question time at the end of each session, we're going to alternate between a question from our in-person audience and a question from our virtual audience. For our Zoom participants, please type your questions into the chat window. One of our organizers is going to be monitoring the chat and they will read out a question into the microphone. When we're coming to the end of the discussion and question period, the moderator will collect a few questions from several people so that the presenters have the benefit of hearing them all, and then they can answer whatever they choose in the time that's remaining. And with that, I want to welcome you all. I'm looking forward to some exciting talks and to learning a lot today. Thank you so much. Now I am going to introduce Daniel Hopkins, who will introduce people for the first session.
I'm Dan Hopkins. I'm a political science professor here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm honored to be with you folks this morning. The first talk is by Daphne Martschenko, Marissa Thompson, Sam Trejo, and A.G. Alvaro. And this is the authorship team. It is titled, "They Have Black in Their Blood, Exploring How Genetic Ancestry Tests Affect Racial Appraisals and Classifications." It will be presented by Daphne Martschenko and Marissa Thompson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us and for doing this. It's awesome to be here and to see so many familiar faces that I've only seen on Zoom or haven't seen in person in a while. So I'm Daphne Martschenko. I'm an assistant professor at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. And as was mentioned, I'm going to be co-presenting this with my colleague, Marissa Thompson, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University, Department of Sociology. And we are joined in the room today by Sam Trejo, who can pitch in for the Q&A. And then our colleague, A.J. Alvaro, is also part of this project. I'm going to be explaining what we did and some of the background and context motivating what we did. And then Marissa's going to give us a talk through what we found and what our perceived or thinking through of next steps might be. Okay, so background and context. As Wendy already mentioned, consumer genetic testing is growing in popularity. In recent news, people probably heard about 23andMe. People have probably heard about some of the financial troubles that 23andMe is experiencing, but there are many, many companies that offer genetic testing to consumers. This figure is not just focused on genetic ancestry testing, which is going to be the focus of a lot of the conversations today, but consumers can access direct-to-consumer genetic testing for clinical and social and behavioral phenotypes, as well as genetic ancestry testing. Just briefly, clicker.
Click on the slides again.
Okay, cool. So just briefly what the process looks like for the average person who is using consumer genetic testing. This is a figure from Ancestry DNA, but they'll purchase a kit online. The kit will come to them in the mail. They'll activate the kit online, then fill up a tube with a saliva sample, place it back in the mail, and get a notification when results are ready. Critically, these test results are often provided with little professional help in terms of deciphering or interpreting those findings. And as we are talking about today, genetic ancestry tests are remaking our conceptions of race. There has been ample news coverage of the ways in which genetic ancestry testing are of race. And they're also being used to claim belonging to racial groups. Again, ample examples of how this is occurring, and I'm just going to talk through one. So this was a story covered in The Atlantic in 2018, but it tells the story of a man named Ralph Taylor, who in 2014 in the state of Washington wanted to apply for, have his insurance company qualify as a disadvantaged business. The program that he applied for was intended and set up to work with and help minority-owned, women-owned companies. To prove his minority status, he submitted the results of a genetic ancestry test. The results said that he was 90% European ancestry, 6% indigenous, and 4% sub-Saharan African ancestry. Government officials were not convinced. Phenotypically, Ralph appeared white. He couldn't provide information of any documented ancestors or relatives who had been racially classified as a minority. And in response to being denied his claim, went forward and filed a lawsuit. The federal district court upheld the decision to deny Ralph's claim. He then appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which also upheld the claim that Ralph was not eligible for this assistance. If you've read Native American DNA by Kim Dahlberg, you might remember some of what she talked about with regards to applicants to Ivy League and other top-ranked schools having their genomes surveyed for Native American DNA and other non-European ancestries with the hopes of gaining racial favor in competitive admissions processes. And we've seen examples of where this has happened. This is just one example in which a man who had adopted twins decided to have them take genetic ancestry tests as they were applying to college in the hopes of being able to have those students have his children identify as members of a racial minority group. The test results came back and said that the twins were 99% indigenous and 11% North African ancestries. The results came after the admissions process had started, but in this New York Times article, the father states that he has intentions to use that information in applying for financial aid for his children. So examples of people using genetic ancestry tests to try and claim a racial minority status in college and selective settings. And this is a piece that Wendy had written in the conversation, but just wanting to emphasize here that genetic ancestry tests don't change your identity, but people still might in response to receiving this information. So, genetic ancestry tests and racial boundaries. Social controversy over who is and is not part of a racial group is an age-old feature of the US racial landscape. It is not a new feature now with the presence of genetic ancestry tests. And as Wendy mentioned already, race and ancestry are often conflated. But we know that race is a socio-political construct, that it is an intricate web and complex of power dynamics, of things like religion, social status, norms, class, skin color, that all come together to inform this construct. And that genetic ancestry tests, which provide approximate estimates of which sections of your genome can be mapped to various populations, are often taken to be providing information, or people are interpreting those tests, providing information about their racial identity. And then again, as mentioned before, consumers receive little information about how to interpret the results that come from genetic ancestry tests. For racial classifications, we know that these logics shaped the racial structure, and that an individual's self-identification does not necessarily map onto how others perceive them. So we'll be using the terms racial identification and racial classification throughout the presentation, identification being how someone self-identifies, classification, how others are identifying them. And there are several fluid dimensions, including genetic ancestry test results, that shape classifications by white individuals. We know this from the existing literature. And we also know that the vast majority of test takers share their genetic ancestry test results with others, including on social media. So with this background and context, I'm going to walk you through the research questions that we had in this project. First and foremost, we were interested in trying to understand, how do Black Americans construct racial boundaries around Blackness? And some of the reasons for wanting to ask this question are, well, we know that in the United States, we have a long history of formalizing Black-white distinctions in particular. And we know that for many African Americans in the United States, it has been difficult to trace origins through family trees or historical documents because of the history of slavery. Alondra Nelson beautifully covered this in her book, The Social Network of DNA. And Frederick Douglass mentioning that genealogical trees do not flourish among slaves. Again, another motivation for wanting to understand specifically how Black Americans think about boundaries around Blackness in the presence of genetic ancestry test information. What we were interested in is that there is less that is known about how in-groups define racial boundaries. And so that was some of the underlying motivation for this study. So we were interested in the effect of genetic ancestry test results on classification and evaluation outcomes, and broke that up into how someone racially classifies another person and how someone feels about or evaluates another person's identification decision. So we had these three questions. What are the effective GAT results on classification and evaluation outcomes? Does the effect of a genetic ancestry test result vary across prior identification and setting? And then are these mediated by perceptions of integrity, discrimination, or shared culture? We employed an experimental design where participants, and we used Yuga, we had a sample of 3,100 Black Americans, US-born Black Americans in particular, who were randomized to receive one of these 6 images. These images were pulled from the Chicago Faces database, and we pre-tested them in Black Americans because we wanted to ensure that this particular population saw these images as being racially ambiguous, and specifically as having a mix of Black-white racial ambiguity. We had participants told about a fictitious individual who was an American citizen, who had been unsure of how to identify, but mostly had or had not identified as Black and African American. And this is an example of one of the images. I'll also briefly mention that we had several different names that people were randomized to receive, and those names can go into more detail in the Q&A, but we also wanted to select for names that didn't immediately signal Black-white racial identification. It goes on to say, Ava recently received her genetic ancestry test results from a company such as 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Genetic ancestry tests use a person's DNA to make an informed guess regarding where a person's ancestors lived. Ava's genetic ancestry test results estimated that she has approximately, and people were told, either 4 or 36% sub-Saharan African ancestry, explaining from countries such as Ghana and Nigeria, and either 96 or 64% non-African ancestry. And then finally, participants were told either that after receiving these GAT results, Ava filled out a government census and identified as Black or African American, or applied for a college scholarship intended for Black and African American students, for example, a scholarship through the NAACP. So key outcomes that we were interested in here: how positively or negatively do you feel about Ava's decision to identify as Black? In your opinion, which race or ethnicity best describes Ava? And in your opinion, how do you think most US-born Black Americans would describe Ava's race and ethnicity? I'm going to hand it over to Marissa now.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to take us through the results for this study. So I'll start by touch on keyboard. Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to start by building out the treatment effects of those key outcomes that Daphne mentioned, starting with the likelihood approval, the evaluation outcome of how people indicate that they feel about Ava's decision. And I'm just going to always say Ava, but this is across, of course, all 12 of the names, decision to identify as Black. And so we set it up this way with the 4 pairwise combinations of our treatment conditions, starting with a version of Ava who has previously been identifying as Black and is now doing so on the census, previously been identifying as Black and is now doing so on a scholarship, and so on and so forth. We pre-registered it this way because we were thinking there might be differences between the different treatment categories. And so I'll just go ahead and put the point estimates up. So these are the treatment effects of high relative to low sub-Saharan African ancestry on each of the 4 combinations of those treatment conditions. Again, we thought that these would be statistically distinct, but it turns out that they weren't. So I'm going to focus most of the conversation on that red coefficient on the side. I realize that people on Zoom probably can't see me pointing, but the red coefficient down on the side, which is the pooled coefficient. And that shows that the effect of the high ancestry condition relative to the low ancestry condition is about a 0.22 standard deviation increase in the likelihood of approval. So the likelihood of a sort of positive evaluation of Ava's identification decision. And now I'm going to switch the outcome to look at the effect on classification, the likelihood that respondents classify Ava as Black. Same situation here where we're going to focus on that red pooled coefficient across all of the outcomes. And here we're seeing that there's about a 0.11 percentage point increase in the likelihood that people classify Ava as Black, say the best race or ethnicity to describe Ava as Black for the high relative to the low ancestry condition. And then finally, we looked at how not only how people themselves are classifying Ava, but how they're thinking that most other US-born Black Americans would classify Ava. So embedding this not only in their own classification of her, but how they think everyone else in the broader Black community is likely to classify her based on the information that they have. And here, again, focusing on that red coefficient, we also see a positive effect of the high relative to the low ancestry condition. That's about a 9 percentage point increase in likelihood of thinking other Black Americans are going to classify Ava as Black. And so I want to show, there's a lot going on in this figure, but I'll walk us through it slowly. So thinking about, again, the fraction of either respondents themselves or their perceptions of others in terms of classifying Ava as Black, we organize this from what we're calling the theoretical low. This is theoretically the lowest likelihood we think of the version of Ava being classified by others as Black. This is a version of Ava who has not been identifying as Black in the past, who is in the 4% sub-Saharan African ancestry condition, who is now identifying as Black on a scholarship, all the way up until the theoretical high, which is a version of Ava who has always been identifying as Black or has mostly been identifying as Black, is doing so now on a census and is in the high sub-Saharan African ancestry condition. And so I want to point us toward this low theoretical low condition. We're still seeing that over 50% of respondents themselves are classifying Ava as Black in this condition. So at the lower end of at least the treatment effects that we have, and we'll see more of a spectrum, I believe, in the next presentation, but at the 4% level, we're seeing that over 50% of respondents themselves are classifying her as Black. And that goes up to about, I think it's about 70% in the theoretical high, that highest sub-Saharan African ancestry condition version of Ava who is has previously identified as Black and is now doing so on a census. Another interesting feature that I'm not going to get into, but I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, is this gap across all of the conditions between the green and the blue bars. And then what that's showing is that on average, across all of these conditions, we see that respondents perceive themselves as more likely to classify Ava as Black than they think everyone else in the broader Black community would be. So there's this disconnect between the way that people themselves are believing this classification logic to work and how they think all or most other Black people in the US would. Again, this is a nationally representative sample, so if they were correct in their estimation, these bars would look much more similar. And so we're seeing that there is this sort of pluralistic ignorance, maybe this idea that people don't actually have as good of an understanding as they think about what the broader community might be thinking or doing. I also want to get into the main effects of setting. So that's that census versus scholarship condition. And then in a moment, I'll also show prior identification. So here we're seeing, and forgive me for putting multiple different units on the same figure. Here we have likelihood approval in standard deviation units, respondent classification in percentage points, and then perception of others classification also in percentage points. And what we see here is that for that high relative to the low sub-Saharan African ancestry condition, we see an increase in approval, a higher level of approval in the census condition. Sorry, I think I misstated that before. In the census condition relative to the scholarship condition, but actually no differences in the classification outcomes. So people are slightly more likely to approve of Ava's decision or have a higher level of likelihood measured approval of Ava's decision in the census condition relative to the scholarship condition, but are actually no differently likely to classify her as Black across those conditions. I'll get to this at the end, but that's also sort of an interesting feature that we're finding, that there's this difference in the evaluation outcomes and the classification outcomes in terms of the features that are affecting them. And then for prior identification, we see that for respondents reading about a version of Ava who has previously been self-identifying as Black, there is a higher level of approval and higher likelihood of classifying her as Black relative to the condition where that version of Ava had not been previously identifying as Black. So prior identification leading to increases across all of these different outcomes. We mentioned mediation and moderation outcomes as well. I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A, but just for time, I'm going to skip right to talking about some of the mechanisms that we're finding here from our topic models. And so part of this study, respondents read this vignette and were asked a number of quantitative outcome questions about Ava, but we also asked them 2 free response questions. So we could get at some of the nuance in terms of trying to understand what exactly they were thinking when they were evaluating Ava and classifying her. And so we asked them these 2 free response prompts at the end of the study. We asked them first about their beliefs about what it means for a person to be Black or African American, the characteristics, the experiences, the attitudes, and the values that define being Black in their minds, in the respondents' minds. And we also asked them specifically about Ava, how they're reacting to her decision to identify as Black in the given setting condition after taking a genetic ancestry test. And here we asked them to specify reactions, thoughts, and emotions about her decision. And so to analyze these findings, we turned to structural topic modeling, which is a machine learning-based analysis of open-ended text responses. It takes the paragraphs that people provided and models word co-occurrence patterns across all documents. So we have 3,100 respondents here, and so we were able to model some of the differences in the way that they're responding based on the experimental treatment condition to which they were assigned. The model then pulls out these latent themes, which we're going to call topics, that are again identified across all of the documents. And this importantly allows us to index some of the nuance that might be missed by other survey questions. So in the other survey questions, we have, the extent to which people approve or disapprove of AVA, but not exactly what's underlying that. Why are they approving or disapproving? And we're able to get some more of that through these free response questions and structural topic models. So I'll get into the weeds very quickly, but I'm happy again to talk more about this in the Q&A. We started with a 50-50 test and train split to make sure that we're not overfitting the data. Took the training data aside and ran the structural topic model using both of these free response questions. And then this is where it got fun. We ended up coding the topics. There are 4 of us on this authorship team. And so we manually went through and coded all of the topics based on the most frequently occurring words for each topic, as well as the top 20 or so documents that had been assigned to each topic. We chose 7 to prioritize for confirmatory analysis. I'll talk about those today, but we're also happy to talk about some of the other topics, as well as our sort of more qualitative analysis of the entire corpus of data, which is underway. Paper. And then, and only then, did we turn back to the testing data after adding to our pre-registration report with these estimates, and then projected the topics onto the reaction to decision responses. So what I'm going to show you next is the causal effect of treatment assignment on topic prevalence. It's going to be a very similar setup to the other outcomes that I showed before. It's going to show, for those people who read about the high sub-Saharan African ancestry condition relative to the low ancestry sub-Saharan African ancestry condition, if there's a difference in the types of topics that show up in the documents that they're writing and the types of things that they're talking about when they're talking about Ava or Daniel or Sam or whatever name that they were assigned to read about. I'm not getting into the causal effects first. I forgot. I have to tell you a little bit more about the topics. So I'll just show you them all at once. These are the 7 topics that we prioritized for confirmatory analysis. Historical diversity, for example, physical features associated with Blackness, culture, the historical one-drop rule, and these are all pulled out by the structural topic model. And this is an example of the ways that people, or the types of documents that were highly likely to be classified under that historical adversity topic. So this respondent, for example, is characterizing the broader African-American experience in their words as years of slavery, oppression, methods set in place by slave masters to keep Black people oppressed during and after slavery, and even to this day. So really defining and talking about Blackness as marked by an experience of historical adversity that has continued over time. In contrast, the STM also pulled out another topic that was similar in some sense, but more focusing on a sense of pride and resilience in overcoming some of this historical adversity. So this respondent wrote, in their opinion, being Black is a privilege and an honor. They're so proud of how my ancestors paved the way for a better today and for more equality tomorrow. We have a bright future. So good news for the Black community. And then finally, and this is of course where the title of our paper comes from, which is from a quote from one of our respondents. People also mentioned the one-drop rule or had language that was associated with the historical legacy of the one-drop rule. And so this person wrote that a person being Black is someone that has Black traits in their blood. And again, this is a Black respondent responding to this vignette and describing Ava as having, or Ava, or whatever name that they were assigned to, as having Black in their blood. And then finally, another topic was on genetic ancestry. So people specifically mentioned the genetic ancestry test as something underlying their decision, in this case saying that Ava shouldn't identify as Black because she only showed 4% sub-Saharan African Ancestry. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the causal effect of treatment assignment on the topics that show up in this second free response question. Okay, so here I've turned it on its side now, but I'm showing coefficients that show the causal effect of the high relative to the low ancestry condition on all of the 7 topics that we prioritize for confirmatory analysis. And as you'll see, actually, none of them are statistically significant. They're all overlapping with 0. So we don't see any statistical differences, at least, in the topics that show up in people's free responses for the high versus the low sub-Saharan African ancestry condition. But when we look across the other experimental conditions, so setting and prior identification, here's where we do see some differences. And I can go ahead and highlight the ones that are statistically significant just to draw your attention to them. So for example, if you look down here at personal choice, we see that for people assigned to read about a version of Ava who was identified as Black on the census, they're more likely to talk about race as a personal choice, to sort of identify and emphasize that people can choose their race for themselves. It's something that is up to a person to decide. But then that language goes away when Ava, the version of Ava that they read about, is identifying as Black on a scholarship. Thank you. I wasn't sure how long I had been talking. So we can see that there are these differences in the ways that people are describing and talking about Ava that are based in, or that are affected by their assignment to read about different settings and different prior identifications. But again, not different ancestry conditions. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what we think this all means now in my remaining 5 minutes. But again, we're happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So what we find in this study is that genetic ancestry tests meaningfully affect in-group conceptions of race. People are using information from genetic ancestry tests to change the ways that they're classifying and evaluating Ava. But we also find a wide range of beliefs about a person's decision to identify as Black that on average seem to be generally consistent with this idea of an inclusive version of hypodescent, where versions of Ava with lower levels of sub-Saharan African ancestry are still sort of considered part of this broader Black community. We find, and this I didn't get into as much in these slides, but happy to talk about in the Q&A. We do find, though, that our treatment effects of ancestry on classification and evaluation operate largely through perceived integrity. So we asked people a number of questions about their perceptions of the integrity of Ava's decision, and that really drove a lot of those responses. And in some cases, they also said that culture also mattered for classifications made by other Black Americans. So culture was something that they believed was underlying other Black Americans' decisions about classifying Ava, but theirs were mostly underlined by perceptions of differences in integrity. We also see, this is those green and blue bars, the differences there, that Black Americans see themselves as more permissive in terms of their classification and acceptance of Ava than the broader Black community. This is something that we're getting into more in currently ongoing experiments. So we're trying to really piece apart why that might be and what is driving those differences. And we view this study as part of a broader project in the social construction and a social constructivist specifically approach to studying race. Given that we know that race is affected by so many different social characteristics about the world, trying to understand, and I guess as is the goal of this entire conference, how genetic ancestry tests fit into that. How do people make sense of them, use them in classification, and embed them within the broader their perceptions at least of the broader Black community's identification and classification decisions. And then to get at a little bit of our theoretical motivation for this study, we're finding that the features that affect appraisals or evaluations are differing from those that affect classifications. So this is what we're calling racial contextualism. We have more about this in the paper. I'll put up a QR code at the end. But to give you a quick overview of what we mean by that, you can imagine a simple model of the world where people's evaluations of how other people are identifying is really based only on a couple things, where it's only based on 2 minutes. This potential friction between racial identification and classification. So if somebody is identifying as Black and I don't approve of their decision to identify as Black, that friction is coming from, that's the difference between how they're identifying themselves and how I'm classifying them. But what we're finding is that that's not always the case. You can think back to the example of setting where we find that people are no differently likely to classify Ava as Black, and yet they're still disapproving in some cases about her decision. So we're finding that, the features that affect this pathway There is also this secondary pathway that's directly affecting people's evaluations that's not necessarily flowing through their classifications. We get into this, we're gonna get into this a little bit more in the paper and in some follow-up studies, but similar to other, dual processes of cognition and action and culture within sociology, we're thinking about the ways that people might be classifying and evaluating using different mechanisms and using those things being affected by different contextual features about a situation. Okay, I'm wrapping up, I promise. So finally, we have some next steps for this study. We are in the process of creating a comparison sample of white Americans to understand how they're taking this exact same study, how those classification and evaluation decisions would look. Further examining these differences between people's views and what they perceive of the broader Black community. We're focusing specifically in on understanding the scholarship versus the census condition. Really interested in particularly in how people think about scarce resources and social closure in those settings. And then doing a more robust qualitative analysis of how, in their own words, Black Americans define being Black. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. The next talk is by Wendy Roth, Ariela Schachter, sorry. Emily Curran and Alex Torrez, and it's titled, How Does Genetic Ancestry Testing Affect Perceptions of Race? It will be presented by Wendy Roth and Emily Curran.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's some really wonderful connections between our paper and the previous paper, except that, they have much nicer slides. But we're very happy to share this with you, and it's, wonderful how much they're in conversation. So an estimated 1 in 5 Americans, as I mentioned earlier, have now taken genetic ancestry tests, or GATs, as I'll call them in this talk. And this really makes GATs maybe the main way that the public is sort of interacting with the revolution in genomic information. And these tests have implications for how people think about race. GATs can lead some people to think that race is genetically determined. And there's research that finds that some GAT takers do change their racial or ethnic identity based on their results. So we're going to share with you some examples of people who have publicly claimed a different race based on GAT results. This is Woa Vicky. She is a social media influencer, maybe some of you have heard of. She declared that she was Black because her GAT results estimated that 44% of her genetic ancestry was African, even though her parents identify as white. And you've already heard a little bit about Ralph Taylor. We're going to talk about him too. He also claimed to be Black, as was previously mentioned. His results showed 4% sub-Saharan African ancestry, but on that basis, he sued Washington State to have his insurance company declared a minority-owned business to help it win these government contracts. And there are also people who have not changed their racial identity, despite receiving GAT results that could lead some to change it. So for example, Henry Louis Gates Jr. received GAT results, estimating that his genetic ancestry was about half European and half sub-Saharan African. Pretty close to Woa Vicky's ancestry estimates, but Gates identified as Black before testing and said that the test didn't change that. And the question that we're asking in this paper is, do other people accept claims like these? So we adopt a framework that recognizes multiple dimensions of the lived experience of race. For instance, racial identity, a person's subjective self-identification, is a distinct dimension from appraised race, or is often called observed race, the race that others believe you to be. And even though these dimensions are different, they influence one another. And many people are classified differently than how they racially identify themselves. Now, most survey and administrative data on race captures racial self-identification, but we argue that appraisals may matter more for a lot of social interactions and outcomes, including employment, housing, interactions with police, incarceration, and also medical treatment, as well as many other outcomes. But we can also think about phenotype or racial appearance. That's another dimension about how people experience race in their lives. Research is showing that there are different experiences and outcomes for people who have the same racial identity, but who differ in aspects of phenotype, like skin color or other features. And this list is not meant to be exhausted. I actually, there are many other dimensions that have been used in the literature, but I do want to emphasize that racial ancestry can be another dimension we can talk about. So most of the time, what people think of, or at least in the past, what people have thought of as racial ancestry has been what they've known about their family history. The compiled racial groups of their ancestors, often that information is passed down by oral history. Maybe there's some, traditional genealogical paperwork research. But that is distinct from genetic ancestry, or the deep biogeographical ancestry that is indicated by genetic testing or research. Now, this doesn't equate with any of these dimensions or either all of them combined, but because it's typically characterized with labels that overlap with common racial categories, people interpret it as relevant for, or even determining a person's race. And this also could become more influential, both on its own and in shaping these other dimensions as more people take GATs and share their results, which we know from the last presentation that they're doing. So in this study, we are focusing on racial appraisals, or how people classify the race of others. Research in this growing field tries to understand the norms that people use to classify individuals and groups in prevailing racial categories. In the US, Ancestry has historically shaped racial appraisals. This led to norms like the one-drop rule, which prioritized ancestry over appearance. And it could lead to someone being reclassified upon learning information about the race of their ancestors. But in practice, phenotype is often a proxy for ancestry because people don't always have access to ancestry information. They're relying on what they see. So when they're making racial appraisals, phenotype is often quite important. But one thing we don't know that much about is how the perception of phenotype interacts with information about genetic ancestry or self-identification. Because people are sharing their GAP results more, it's possible that access to this personal genomic information could be shifting norms of racial classification. The questions that we are asking here are, first, how much do GAP results influence observers' racial appraisals relative to other factors like their appearance, self-identification, or the social context? What types of racial identity claims based on genomic information are accepted by others? And how much variation is there by respondents' race in accepting people's racial identity claims after GAT testing? So we also conducted a conjoint survey experiment, which lets us compare the effects of multiple signals on racial appraisals simultaneously. We have nationally representative samples of non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic White, and Hispanic adults. This survey was administered online in English or Spanish in early 2023. And each respondent classified the race of 10 profiles, giving us more than 90,000 profile observations. We showed respondents hypothetical profiles of middle-class 18-year-old women or men who had taken a GAT, We assigned initials to profiles rather than names to avoid conveying cultural information. The profiles contain several randomized attributes. So first, we had a morphed photo of a man or a woman's face. We also had their racial self-identification before taking the GAT, the ancestry percentage breakdown from their GAT results, and their racial self-identification after taking the GAT. And we also focused on the black-white color line, which has always been so important in US society. For the morphed photos, we took original images from the Chicago Face Database that norming data showed were consistently classified as white or black. And then we used the software WebMorph to morph different same gender pairs in these percentages. A 95% black, 5% white morph, which we refer to here as a black appearing photo. A 50% black, 50% white morph, which we refer to as ambiguous. And a 5% black, 95% white morph, which we refer to as a white appearing photo. These are just examples of our 240 morphed photos. Each gender pair here is a mix of the same two source photos in these different proportions. The morphing software blends facial features and skin tone together in these proportions, but it doesn't work well for hair. And so like most studies that use morph photos, we remove the hair and focus on facial features, which we realize is a limitation of the study. We randomized the individual's racial self-identification both before and after GAT testing with these three categories: black, white, and biracial. And in fact, one contribution of this work is that we include this biracial option, which few other studies have done. This lets us explore whether observers would appraise others in this way and whether respondents see biracial as a way of understanding people with a combination of mixed traits. Profiles were assigned a combination of specific Northwestern European and West African ancestries in these percentages. For the talk, we'll refer to these as predominantly European, mostly European, evenly mixed, mostly African, and predominantly African ancestries. And we used detailed ancestry categories like these that appear in commercially available GATs, for example, British or Nigerian. But we also included the broader subcontinental regions in parentheses, and this information often appears on commercial GATs as well. Now, based on a large scholarship showing that racial appraisals are shaped by social context, we also randomized the context of the profiles. We expected that the social context might matter for how observers weigh the GAT results, the identity claims, and the other factors. And so potentially relevant social contexts include those that prime competition for scarce resources. We also indicated that the people in the profiles were applying to college. We said that they were applying to a college that's looking to grow its Black student body. And these data were collected before the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, when it was reasonable that someone might claim a Black identity based on GAT results in order to gain an advantage in the way that we saw with the example. Another relevant factor or context could be one that primes symbolic belonging without competition for scarce resources. For this, we indicated that the people in the profiles were applying to join a high school social club, a non-political one, intended for Black students that's looking to grow its membership. We might also expect different weighing of racial cues in a context that primes concepts of biological racial difference. For this, we indicated that the people in the profiles were registering for a bone marrow drive looking to grow its Black donor base. And then other people had a neutral condition with no additional information. Respondents were randomized to one of these 4 conditions for all the profiles that they saw. So here's an example of what respondents might see, and the parts that are in red are the randomized items. First, an introduction screen that said, we are interested in understanding how people think about race in the United States. You'll be presented with information about a series of hypothetical people. They are all 18-year-old high school seniors who grew up in middle-class neighborhoods. The people in the profiles are registering for a bone marrow drive looking to grow its Black donor base. HL has always identified himself as white. He recently took a genetic ancestry DNA test, which reported 50% British, Northwestern European, 50% Nigerian, West African. He is planning to identify himself as biracial on the bone marrow donation form. What race do you think HL is? Black, white, or biracial? And respondents who select biracial are given a follow-up question. Even people who are biracial often have one race that describes them best. Which single category best describes HL's race, Black or white? And now for our analysis, I'm going to turn the talk over to my co-author.
Thank you, Wendy. So I'm going to walk us through our results, and I'll start with walking you through what we did for our analysis. So for our first research question about how much GATs influence racial appraisals relative to other factors, our dependent variable is the probability of the profile being classified as Black relative to all other factors. And this is either in the first or the second survey question. And for our second and third research question on what types of identity claims are accepted by others, our dependent variable is the probability of accepting the profile's self-ID after testing. So for instance, if the profile self-identifies as white after the GAT, the respondent then also classifies them as white, and we would code this as being accepting. And treatment effects in conjoint designs are called average marginal component effects. We estimate them using ordinary least squares with clustered standard errors to account for respondents repeating the experiment multiple times. AMCEs are always conditional on other treatments in the experiment. So to estimate the independent effects of any treatment, it has to be fully randomized relative to all others. This means we have to create profiles with both common and uncommon combinations of traits. To address our first research question, we will be looking at the probability of the profile being classified as Black. Before we move on to this, let's take a step back and look at baseline differences in classification for all profiles. This figure shows the percent of respondents who classify profiles as white, Black, or biracial by race. All respondents were more willing to classify a profile as Black or biracial than white. White respondents are more likely than Black and Hispanic respondents to classify a profile as biracial. We see here that 40% of white respondents first classify a profile as biracial, while only 30% of Black respondents and 35% of Hispanic respondents first classify a profile as biracial. And we see here that Black respondents are more willing than other groups to classify profiles as Black. And this is in conversation with what we heard from Marissa and Thompson and colleagues' paper. So now we will take a closer look at what factors increase the likelihood of classifying a profile as Black. This shows the AMCEs for all of our treatments. For each variable, the first value listed here is the reference category. So the GAT results are a powerful predictor of racial appraisals. Relative to predominantly European ancestry, every increase in African ancestry treatments increases the probability of Black classification. Mostly European ancestry treatments increases it by 4 points. And evenly mixed ancestry treatments, it increases it by 17 points. Mostly African treatments increase Black classification by 25 points. And going from mostly to predominantly African ancestry treatments is just a slight additional increase of 2 more points to 27. But GAT treatments are not as strong of an influence as the type of photo, which is by far the strongest predictor. So relative to a white appearing photo, an ambiguous photo treatment increases Black classification by 46 points. A Black appearing photo treatment increases Black classification even more by 68 points. The impacts of how the profile person self-identified are weaker. Relative to white, Black initial self-identification treatments before taking a GAT increases a Black classification by 7 points, and biracial self-identification before testing increases it by 4 points. And the effects of a profile's self-identification after testing are a little weaker still. A Black identification after testing increases a Black classification by 5 points relative to white, and a biracial identification after testing increases it by just 2 points. And the social context treatments we tested showed the least influence. In general, observers are much more influenced by phenotypical and genomic factors than they are by social factors, like the person's identity claims or the social context. So our second question was, what types of racial identity claims based on genomic information are accepted by others? This shows the effect of GAT results on the probability of accepting a profile's self-identification after testing by the identity they claimed across all other treatments. The red X's show that the likelihood of accepting a profile's white self-identification is highest with predominantly European ancestry GAT treatments at 44%. The probability decreases as African ancestry's treatments increase to 50%. But after that, it's basically unchanged for mostly and predominantly African ancestry treatments. For the probability of accepting a profile's Black identity claim, we see the reverse pattern. From predominantly European ancestry to evenly mixed ancestry treatments, the probability of acceptance is similar, around 30%. But it increases to 50% probability with mostly African GAT treatments and about 58% with predominantly African ancestry treatments. The probability of accepting a profile's biracial self-identification has an inverse U-shaped pattern, peaking when GAT treatments show evenly mixed ancestry. And these general patterns repeat when we restrict the analysis to particular treatments. For instance, this shows the predicted rates of profile acceptance just for profiles treated with a white appearing photo and with a white self-identity before testing. This blue dot is similar to Ralph Taylor, who initially identified as white, had a white appearance, discovered 4% African ancestry, and then claimed a Black identity. The predicted rate of observers accepting this identity claim after testing is only 5%. And even if his GAT results had shown 25% African ancestry or 50% African ancestry, that predicted rate of acceptance doesn't significantly change. But if someone like Ralph Taylor had said he was biracial after testing, observers would have been a bit more accepting, with 17% probability. And as we see here with the red X's, with a white appearing photo and a white self-ID before testing, the probability of accepting a white self-ID after testing is above 50% regardless of GAT treatments. Here, we see the predicted rates of profile acceptance for profiles treated with an ambiguous photo and a white self-ID before testing. This blue dot resembles someone like Woa Vicky, who previously identified as white, had a somewhat racially ambiguous appearance, received GAT results close to 50% African genetic ancestry, and claimed to be Black. Respondents have about a 27% probability of accepting her identity claim. If someone like her claimed to be biracial, her identity claim would have more than a 70% probability of acceptance. And this shows the predicted rates of profile acceptance for profiles treated with a Black appearing photo and a Black self-ID before testing.
This blue dot resembles someone like Henry Louis Gates, who previously identified as Black, is Black appearing, received GAT results close to 50% African ancestry, and continued to identify as Black. Respondents have about a 65% probability of accepting his identity claim. In other words, most people would agree with the claim of someone like Gates, even if their GAT results had evenly mixed ancestries. With a Black appearing photo and a Black self-ID before testing, the probability of accepting a Black self-ID after testing is above 60%, regardless of GAT treatments. The probability of accepting a biracial self-ID after testing, however, remains below 50%, regardless of GAT treatments. And this rate decreases even further when we examine the likelihood of respondents accepting a white self-ID claim. This remains below 20%, regardless of GAT treatments. Taken together, these findings speak to the emphasis that American respondents are putting on appearance. Finally, our third question asks, how much variation is there by respondent race in acceptance of the profile's self-identification after GAT results? This shows the predicted rates of accepting a profile's racial identity after testing for profiles treated with a white appearing photo, a white self-ID before, and a Black self-ID after testing by GAT treatments and respondent race. This represents someone like Roth Taylor, who initially identified as white, had a white appearance, discovered 4% African ancestry, and then claimed a Black identity. Here, we see that regardless of respondent race, there is very low likelihood of accepting a claim like his. And if we zoom out, we see that there are no substantive differences by respondent race on the probability of accepting Black self-ID after claims across GAT treatments. This shows the predicted rates of acceptance for profiles with an ambiguous photo, a white self-ID before, and a Black self-ID after testing by GAT treatments and respondent race. Here, we see more variation by respondent race. So we can think of these points as representing someone like Wowabiki. Black respondents are more likely than white and Hispanic respondents to accept a claim like hers. We see the same heterogeneity by respondent race for profiles treated with GAT results that have more of a mixture of ancestries. But we find more convergence by respondent race at these GAT treatments where ancestries are either predominantly European or predominantly African. And this shows the predicted rates of acceptance by respondent race for profiles treated with a Black appearing photo and a Black self-ID before and a Black self-ID after testing. Again, we can think of these coefficients as resembling someone like Henry Louis Gates. Black respondents are most likely to accept a claim like his, followed by Hispanic respondents and then white respondents. We also see here that regardless of GAT treatments, white respondents are less likely than Black and Hispanic respondents to accept a Black self-ID claim. But the opposite is true when we look at similar treatments, so a Black appearing photo and a Black self-ID before testing, and we estimate the probability of accepting a biracial identity after testing. So this figure shows the predicted rates of accepting a profile's racial identity after testing for profiles by respondent race that are also treated with a Black appearing photo and a Black self-ID before testing, but instead are treated with a biracial self-ID after testing. Here, we see that regardless of GAT treatments, white respondents are more likely than Black and Hispanic respondents to accept a biracial self-identity claim. So to conclude, we found that GAT results do influence observers' racial appraisals, more than their identity claims or the social context. But phenotype has the greatest impact on racial appraisals, even when genetic ancestry and self-identity are known. This suggests that appearance is not just a proxy for ancestry or a person's identity, but has become a greater influence in its own right. So racial identity claims are accepted more when they fit phenotype. And when appearance is ambiguous or ancestry is more mixed, biracial identities are more accepted. Our findings suggest that some observers may accept biracial identities that span the Black-white color line, but they're less willing to accept claims that jump across it. And we also found some differences in racial appraisals by race of the respondent. When a profile appears white and switches from a white to a Black racial identity, there's general consistency in how respondents of different races perceive that person. There's low levels of acceptance of the Black identity claim across all respondents. But when a profile appears racially ambiguous or Black respondents are often more likely to accept their claims to be Black than white or Hispanic respondents. And this is true even when GATs report substantial amounts of European ancestries. Black respondents may be more open to including multiracial Black Americans as a part of the Black community than white or Hispanic respondents, a form of inclusive application of the one-drop rule. But white respondents, in their greater tendency to accept a biracial identity, may be less willing to apply a one-drop rule than others. We were surprised, however, that we found few differences by social context. This is something we welcome feedback on. And given this audience, we especially welcome feedback on the bone marrow donation context. Perhaps this context does not lead to a greater geneticization of race because a general random sample is simply not aware enough of bone marrow donations and transplants, or how clinicians have sometimes tried to match donors and patients by race. Or perhaps there are better medical contexts to use, and a bone marrow drive is simply not the best one to prime biological concepts of race. And one thing we're interested in for future work is how racial appraisals are made in medical and clinical contexts. So these are the interests that prompted this symposium, and we welcome feedback on our work, and we also hope that some of the later presentations answer these questions. Thank you.